Sister Shauna continues to improve. Didn't mean to leave her out, so hopefully she'll continue to be so that she can be with us. Our study tonight, of course, is still in looking at characters in the Old Testament, and we've been now for several weeks looking at the history of Israel during the period of the Judges. And some of the Judges we have been able to learn some lessons from because we have had a great deal revealed about them. On the other hand, there have been other Judges that we've just had single or maybe two verses that doesn't tell us a whole lot about them. And that's true of at least the first three that we're going to be studying this evening. Not much to be said about them. And certainly we'll see what we can find concerning them. And let's remember that the purpose of our study and the reason why that we still have the Old Testament scriptures is that they're given for our learning. And we're trying our best to learn the lessons that we can learn from the characters that we have additional sufficient information about, and that's, hopefully that will be true as we continue. We're looking tonight at Judges chapter 12, and I do hope that you read from that 8th verse of chapter 12 all the way through chapter 16, because that gets us through the four that we don't have much information about, but at the same time, the one that we do, and that, of course, is Samson. But those are the verses that we find these given, and I hope that you take time before, had 2 weeks since the gospel meeting was last week. So hopefully you've read this, and we'll be able to fill in the information that we may not necessarily deal with in the outline. In Judges 12, beginning with verse 8, then after him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons. He gave them 30 daughters in marriage outside his clan and brought in 30 young women from outside for his sons. He judged Israel for 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried at Bethlehem. So that's our first judge in our study tonight. Verse 11, after him, Elon, the Zebulonite, judged Israel, and he judged Israel for 10 years. Then Elon, the Zebulonite, died and was buried at Abdon in the land of Zebulun. So that's the second judge that we will look at tonight. And then in verses 13 through 15, after him, Abdon, son of Hal, the Palonite, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys. He judged Israel for 8 years. Then Abdon, son of Hal, the Palonite, died and was buried at Parathon in the land of Ephraim, in the hill country of the Amalekites. So looking at the 3 judges that we've read about in these verses, looking at Ibzan, I got on the internet to find out how to pronounce his name, and I still can't remember it. But Ibzan, which we read about in verses 8, 9, and 10, recall he differs from Jephthah, which was the last judge that we studied a couple of weeks ago, because Jephthah only had 1 daughter, whereas we find that Jephthah offered his daughter unto God. Ibzan obtained husbands for the 30 daughters that he had. We find that he judged Israel for 7 years. We're not given any information as to any deliverance that he might have made or who it was against or any oppressor that God may have brought. We're just simply given very few details other than the fact that he died and he was buried in the city of Bethlehem. Elon, that we read about in verses 11 and 12, his name means oak. And he judged Israel for 10 years. And we know even less about him, or at least less about his family. And all we have is that he died and was buried at Abdon in the land of Zebulun. And then Abdon, that in verses 13, 14, and 15, his name means service or servant. He had 40 sons, 30 grandsons, who rode on 70 donkeys. What maybe significance that we can draw from that would be to the possibility be that this indicated that he was a man of prestige for him to have 70 donkeys in his possession to give to his children and give to his grandchildren. We know that he judged Israel for 8 years, and he died and was buried at Pirathon in the land of Ephraim. So these are the 3 judges that we see in chapter 12 following Jephthah that we studied about 2 weeks ago. And of course, we had a great deal that we found out that was revealed about him. But these are the 3 that we see that followed. Now comes to a judge of which I'm sure we can go all the way back to our childhood and remember the name of and remember some particular instances in regards to this judge of Israel, Samson. We read about his story in chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16. So we see 4 chapters of details that are given to us about Samson. But what we see in particular, now that we're looking at him, is that repeated cycle that we have seen all through the book of Judges so far. Israel is at peace, then Israel does what we see in verse 1 of chapter 13, does evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord delivers them into the hands of an oppressor. And this time, it is the Philistines. And that oppression covers a time period of 40 years. And we read all of this in just the very first verse of chapter 13. To look at a summary of Solomon's life, going almost to the end, or all the way to the end of the book, we know that he was a judge of Israel for 20 years. Even though the oppression of the Philistines was 40, he was judged for half of that period of time. But then getting back to the earlier part of his life, he was from the tribe of Dan. He was the son of Manoah. He had a miraculous birth. His mother was barren and had not been able to bear children. And he was a Nazirite from his mother's womb. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. We see that even in the case here that his mother, because Samson was to be a Nazirite from birth and to be a Nazirite all of his life, we find that even his mother was forbidden to drink wine or strong drink or to eat anything unclean during her pregnancy, which was some of the restrictions that were placed upon the Nazirite as a result of the Nazirite vow. And this, of course, we read in chapter 13, verses 2 through 7, and then later on in chapter 13, verses 24 and 25. So let's look at this Nazirite vow, just to kind of get off track a little bit. There's some things that we need to understand and some things that we need to make sure that we don't confuse with this word, Nazirite. The Nazirite vow, if you want to read it in detail, is found in Numbers chapter 6, there in verse 2, beginning and going through verse 21. And to read down through there, just to see the highlights of what this vow consisted of, he was to separate, the one who took the vow was to be separate himself unto the Lord. And this separation involved what we see in verses 3 and 4. He is to separate himself from wine and similar drink. He shall drink neither vinegar made from wine, nor vinegar made from similar drink. Neither shall he drink any grape juice, nor eat fresh grapes or raisins. All of the days of his separation, he shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, from seed to skin. Another thing that we find concerning this Nazirite vow is in verse 5. All of the days of the vow of his separation, no razor shall come upon his head until the days are fulfilled. He shall be holy. Then he shall let the locks of the hair of his head grow. In verse 6 and 7, he shall not go near a dead body. He shall not make himself unclean, even for his father or his mother, for his brother or his sister when they die, because his separation to God is on his head. And in verse 8, all of the days of his separation, he shall be holy to the Lord. Usually, the Nazirite vow, whenever it was taken for a relative period of time, generally a relative short period of time. But in Samson's case, Samson was to be a Nazirite all of his life. So he stands truly unique in regards to this Nazirite vow. And two, this is the part that I mentioned a moment ago about being sure that we don't confuse. The Nazirite vow, the difference between taking the vow and being a Nazarene, let us understand that a Nazarene is a person from Nazareth. Jesus was a Nazarene, as we find there in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 23. So let's not confuse being a Nazarene with being a Nazirite, because one is a vow that implies all of the things that we have saw in Numbers 6, as opposed to just simply a person who was from the city of Nazareth. So that's why I thought it might be well if we just spend a moment or two to look at the vow of what all is implied, since after all, Samson was to be a Nazirite all of the days of his life, as opposed to getting confused when we see that Jesus, like in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 23, was a Nazarene, and be sure that we can know the difference. The other thing that we can see, picking back up with the summary of Samson's life, he desired a Philistine woman for his wife. And we see that in chapter 14. And we see that this is when he slays the lion, which is one of the things that we probably remember, one of the first things that we remember as a child when we were being taught about Samson. His marriage feast is recorded there in chapter 14, and it's there that he tells a riddle. In fact, Samson was somewhat noted for his riddles. And this is where we are first introduced to him at his marriage feast here in verses 8 through 19 of chapter 14. It's in verse 19 that he slays 30 Philistines. Remember, they are the oppressors of Israel for the period of 40 years, and Samson has come along at about the halfway point in their oppression. And now we see him slaying 30 of these Philistines. He is kept away from his wife in verse 20, as well as in chapter 15, mention is made in the first few verses. And as a result of that, he takes vengeance. And because of that, we find, and now we are revealed in chapter 15, additionally with his great strength, not just in having slain the lion earlier, but now we see his great strength. And this, of course, is even made mention of in the Hebrew letter in Hebrews chapter 11. Notice that in verse 32, I didn't put this on the paper, but it said, how shall I say more? For times will fail to me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah, of David also and Samuel, and of the prophets. So Samson is made mention of in what we call the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Then we see in chapter 15, verses 13 through 17, that he slays 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. He is miraculously supplied with water after this event. And it's now that we are introduced to the person that we most always associate with Samson, and that is Delilah. He lives with Delilah. She's a harlot. And we know that she schemed and plotted to help the Philistines to try and overcome Samson, because again, we read earlier he killed 60, then we read that he killed 1,000, and certainly the Philistines are wanting to get the upper hand. Find out what this man is, what we can do against this man. So Delilah is the one that they went through in order to get to Samson. And then, of course, in later years, we find that he is blinded by the Philistines after, and we'll be talking about the events in between here, but he was, at the end of his life, he was blinded by the Philistines. And he was confined to hard labor in prison. And this is where they used him like they had used an animal in order to continue his imprisonment and the punishment of his imprisonment for all that he had done against the Philistines. And of course, he pulls, in the very end, he pulls down the pillars of the temple where he meets his death. But in his death, he slays a multitude of Philistines. And that we read in the closing verses of Judges chapter 16. And again, reminding ourselves that he is mentioned in the book of Hebrews. So, what are the lessons that we can learn from Samson? One lesson I truly think that we need to learn from him is it's important to marry wisely and not let our physical desires control our decisions. And that's what we see Samson having done. We read it in the 14th chapter, verses 1, 2, and 3. His parents did not approve of that marriage. And not only did his parents not approve, the law of Moses forbid the marriage of Israelites to Philistines or to anyone else that was of the land of Canaan. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Gary, read us that, verse 3. So see, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 7. This is when Moses is given instructions that he had received from God in reference to the conduct of the children of Israel. They're going into the land of Canaan. Joshua, of course, will conquer it for them. And one of the things that they were to do that they did not do was completely drive out or completely destroy all of the inhabitants of Canaan. And the reason why is that because it was through Israel, it was through Joshua that God was bringing executing judgment upon the land of Canaan. It just wasn't a matter of God saying, hey, I want my people to have this land. It was a matter that God was bringing judgment. These people were idolaters to the bone. And now their sin had come to seed, we might say. And God being merciful, God being a God of justice and mercy, long-suffering, that has an end at some point. And so at the time in which Joshua is about to obtain the leadership of the children of Israel, this is what God allows to happen. He allows Canaan to be conquered. But even the children of Israel did not follow God's instructions completely. Utterly destroy, utterly drive out all, and have no relationships with them. And this is what we've read in Deuteronomy 7 and verse 3. Don't make marriages with them. Don't give your daughters to their sons. Don't take their daughters for your sons. And of course, we know what happened because we know it's a repeated cycle in the history of Israel. These people influenced Israel to idolatry without exception. So God knew what he was talking about. And we see what happens when we don't follow through on what God says to do. But despite this, God was able to use this situation for good. Because verse 4 of Judges chapter 14, read that for us, Brother Rex.
But his father and mother did not know that it was the Lord that he was seeking to occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel.
All right. Remember we said his parents didn't approve of Samson's marriage. But we're given the information that God is working in the background. And what God is doing is that he is seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. Why? Because they were the ones that were oppressing Israel. They were the ones that had dominion over Israel. So now God is raising up Samson to deliver Israel. Israel has had peace. Israel has done evil in the sight of the Lord. They have been oppressed now for 20 years, and they've repented and they've asked God. God is bringing forth a deliverer. And that's what we see over and over and over again in the book of Judges. So even though the marriage was contrary to the law of Moses, God used it as an occasion to accomplish his will. And ultimately, we know that Samson's wife and his father-in-law were murdered by the Philistines themselves. Which brings us up to the point where that Samson allowed that which pleased him to make his choice for marriage. Remember, we're studying a lesson to be learned. A lesson that tells us marriage is something that needs to be entered into wisely, and marriage is something that is to transcend the physical desires. They are not to be that which solely controls our decision. But yet we see that Samson allowed that very thing. He allowed that, the physical desire, to control it and to make his decisions there in chapter 14 and verse 7. You see, before marrying, one should reflect upon what God desires. And we know that's difficult because you take, and I've found out in some cases it don't take just two young people. It can also happen to two old people. They get so infatuated with marriage, with one another, that, as the old saying is, love is blind. And I've always used a little joke that the two times in a man's life that you can't tell him nothing is when he's buying a car and when he's getting married. And I think that's about true of the case. Because it just seems like that we're not interested in advice, we're not interested in what you think, we're just, we know how we feel. And that's the bottom line. So we need to understand that reflection upon what God desires, not what's pleasing totally to themselves. In Ephesians 5, verse 15, Shane?
See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise.
That's a principle that can be applied in you name it. Walk circumspectly. That means looking all around, forward, behind, to both sides. Consider the consequences. Don't just think for here and for now, but think of the results of this action. Think of the consequences, the possible consequences of this action. Walk circumspectly. Don't have blinders on like what we used to put on a mule or something in order to keep him concentrated on going down that road that he was plowing. But walk circumspectly. Look all around, because as it says, to not do so, that's being foolish. But let's rather instead be wise. And we must never forget that marriage is a lifelong decision. And that's becoming harder and harder to plant into a person's mind, whether young or whether old. Because we have society all around us, we have family all around us that has divorces. And when I'm talking about divorces in that respect is divorce over trivial reasons. Not because of fornication, but just you name it. Because the attitude is with the world that, well, we'll get married. If it don't work out, we'll get divorced. I remember Sissy Spacek, I remember her because she played Loretta Lynn in the movie that, of course, where we lived in Virginia, Butcher Hollow wasn't all that far on the other side of the hill from where we lived. But I remember her because she made the remark, whoever it was she married to, I couldn't remember who his name was, but she said they had already started, it was either a bank account or a savings account, and they were putting money in that in order to have money for the divorce. And the ink hadn't even dried on the on the marriage license. So see, that's where the world is. So we must be sure that we understand like what Jesus said. Someone read us, Ben, read us Matthew 19, verses 5 and 6.
For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate.
All right. That's God's desire. Remember we said a moment ago, back up in point 1, that we should reflect upon what God desires. Well, we should understand what it is that God desires when marriage is made. God desires it to be till death. One man for one woman, for life. The only exception being that of fornication, and the reason is that they're no longer, when they marry, they're no longer two. They're one. Just like Adam and Eve were one bone and one flesh. When God took the rib from man and made woman, that's what Adam said. She should be called woman because she was taken from man. So marriage symbolizes that very thing. One flesh, one bone, no longer two. And marriage is not just a society thing. Oh, yes, a lot of it involves society and the practice and the rules of society, but ultimately, marriage involves God. And what Jesus said is, what God has joined together, man must not separate, not that man can't. Really and truly, man can't. Man can't do nothing with the bond. They can do all sorts of things with the marriage, but they can't do nothing with the bond. Because what God joins together, marriage, for whatever the reason other than fornication, is not going to sever the bond. So no, there's not going to be a separation because God has done the joining. What we need to do is to have and consider a mate that will help you to put to death your members that are on the earth, that will help you put to death fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. It's because of these things that the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. But now you yourselves are to put off these. Marry a mate that will help you put off anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Not lie to one another, since you put off the old man with his deeds and to put on the new man that's renewed in knowledge, according to the image of him that created him. All of these things involve the character, the person that we can become, and it is the person that we will become dependent upon our mate. There's no other relationship, not even the child and the mother relationship, that is so close as that of a husband and wife. So, marry a mate that will help you to be all of these things that are stated in Colossians 3, verses 5 through 10. So the one lesson is important to marry wisely, and don't let a physical desire control our decisions like it did with Samson, and we see the trouble he got into because of Delilah. A second lesson, pride goes before destruction. We see that in chapter 16, really the entire chapter. Samson was taken with the beauty of a woman. The text says he loved her. The Philistines convinced her to find out the secret to Samson's strength. At first, Samson tried to discourage her. He, however, ends up, after her continual and constant inquiring, he told her, well, on one occasion, he told her that the secret was bind me with 7 green twigs that have never dried. And she did. And when she hollered, the Philistines are coming, Samson, he broke the twigs and escaped. Not that they were really coming, but at least that was the language she used to test whether or not he told her the truth. The next time, when she kept digging and trying to find, he told her to bind them with new ropes that had never been used. When she did, then she hollers, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he broke the ropes. So she knew that she'd not been told the truth at that point. She continues to dig. Next, he tells to weave his hair with the web. She does that. And again, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And his strength was just the same as before. But finally, after continually being, what word did you use? Nagged? Or whatever, it just continually got to the point that he just, he tells her. He tells her, cut my hair. And of course, think about this. You know, surely Samson must have known the Philistines were coming after him, because in every test of what might have made him weak, Delilah would holler out, "The Philistines are upon me." You know, doesn't he know and doesn't he realize that now, if he's going to really and truly tell her the real source of his strength, that's going to be used against him? But be that as it may, why did he tell Delilah about his hair? Maybe there's an answer to that in chapter 16 and verse 20. It could be that he might have thought that the Lord would be with him regardless of what he said or what he did. Donnie, read us that verse 20.
The Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him.
You see, there's that little confidence that he has when he says, you know, I'll go out as before at other times and I'll shake myself free. So that's why we're saying that it could very well be that he thought that the Lord would be with him regardless of what he said. The truth of the matter is, no one, not even Samson, and we've studied other Old Testament characters, no one is too high that they are above God. In Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 1, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. In Obadiah chapter 1 verses 3 and 4, the pride of your heart, listen to this, the pride of your heart has deceived you, you who dwell in the cliffs of the rock, whose habitation is high, you who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you ascend as high as the eagle, and though you set your nest above the stars, from there I will bring you down, says the Lord. Time's running out. Third lesson. While we yet live, it's never too late to turn to God. I think that is a lesson that we can see in the study of Samson. See, first the Philistines, they put out Samson's eyes so that he couldn't see. Then they put him into a mill to work like a donkey or mule. The Philistines give credit for Samson's capture to their god, God Dagon. And they make a celebration to honor their God. And it's during this celebration that they call for Samson so that they can mock him. They really got Samson where they wanted. And it's at this time Samson calls upon the Lord one last time in verse 28 of Judges 16. And the Lord returned Samson's strength to him. Samson pushed against two of the mighty pillars in Dagon's temple. And it was said that Samson slew more in his death than he did in his life. And that's found in verse 30 of chapter 16. But see, in all that we've read about Samson, his life was not entirely praiseworthy. You see, he married outside of Israel, which was against the law of Moses. He fraternized with harlots, and he was not above telling an occasional lie from time to time for his own purposes. And he allowed the pretty face to control his life. But however, in the end, Samson gave himself over wholly to the Lord. Samson was made blind. He was treated like an animal, which no doubt maybe helped him to realize who had given him his strength. How many times do we fall into this kind of a situation? Do we recognize from whom our true strength comes every day? Do we? Samson repented of his evil attitude in the end, and God granted him a blessing. And again, as we said, Samson's name is down in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. God is a merciful. He's a forgiving God. In Psalms 37, verse 23, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his ways. Though he fall, he shall not be utterly cast down, for the Lord upholds him with his hand. I have been young, and now I'm old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. He is ever merciful and lends, and his descendants are blessed. Depart from evil and do good, and dwell forevermore. For the Lord loves justice and does not forsake his sons. They are preserved forever, but the descendants of the wicked shall be cut off. In Psalms 103, verse 8, the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in mercy. He will not always strive with us, nor will he keep his anger forever. He has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor punished us according to our iniquities. For as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is his mercy toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those that fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. As for man, his days are like grass. As the flower of the field, so he flourishes. For the wind passes over it, and it's gone, and its place remembers it no more. But the mercy of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, and his righteousness to children's children, to such as keep his covenant, and to those who remember his commandments to do them. Jesus said in Luke 6 and verse 32, therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. And Hebrews 8, verse 12, for I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. So quite a character Samson was. And I appreciate the time that we've had to study him. Lord willing, we'll be looking at the last two judges in our character study in next week's study, when we look at Eli and Samuel. So it's on your papers what you would do well to read between now and that time. About seven and a half chapters will cover these two characters that we'll be studying. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention, for being able to study together.